So
Okay,
while here the talk is loaded, I once heard a definition of what is a scientist. A scientist is someone who doesn't really know where he or she goes, but keeps on going until they are in a new place. And believe it or not, it does apply to me to an extent, but only to an extent, because I used to work in the UK, the National Health Service, as a clinician at Hammersmith Hospital and then Charing Cross Hospital. And it was child development and the diagnostics of child development and cancers. Since 1990, the rate of cancer in the UK has gone up by a quarter. And I've just been to Poundbury, which is the Duchy of Cornwall, and that family has 2 cases of cancer. In all likelihood, acquired relatively early. So if we want to look for outcomes, we might just, we might just see whether the public health concern that is monetizable is a good driver. So keep that in the background, because as a GP, diagnosis is good. If you have no therapy, you give the patient something, a little cleanup to do here and there, but you know there's nothing you can fundamentally do. I think I've wasted my time well enough, so I could actually go into the talk. I've said that all. Now, to understand the reasoning of why the material that I'm introducing to you is not a chance discovery, there are elements of chance, but it was searched for quite specifically. And the reason for that is that I worked, and I'm still associated, for the Australian Nuclear Science and Technology Organization, and now more recently with the Commonwealth Science and Industry Research Organization. That's essentially 95% of the large infrastructure, research infrastructure in Australia. And certainly the nuclear sector knows everything about circularity. And it's also an example how an industry for 60 years can know everything, not act, and then actually no longer be in the game. Nobody ever believed it. Obviously, I'm not making friends within the industry when I say, look, you've lost your trust. You will never return. But we can learn from that industry, because that industry can trace the impact, the whereabout, the speed of decay, everywhere at any time. There's no industry that I would know that is any better and has the total toolkit, not just big instruments, but also handheld instruments, pretty much everything on first principle. Now, my engagement with the plastics issue, somewhat indirect, was around radiation in the environment, and then introduced to through Jennifer Lavers, who possibly should be a person here in the room, and her work was cited earlier on, introduced me to essentially a discussion with Sir David Attenborough, who quite presently said, plastic is here to stay. We're not going to get rid of it. More elegantly phrased than I do. And the question comes, in what form is it actually acceptable? And that form that is acceptable informs to a degree what I will be talking about in terms of materials or solutions to essentially control the plastics that we use. Of course, we did publish a fair bit. Since 2012 to 2017, the interannual or annual variations, plastic floating down between Lord Howe Island and Hobart. That route not chosen coincidentally, but because it's nice to sail. So it was a doable project, but also it gave us an enormous publicity. And I could pontificate in front of 3,000 people to not much effect, because since 2012, there has been no material change in the spillage, in the supply chain whatsoever. I could totally repeat what Mark Orr has said earlier. Biggest cleanup in the world. It was certainly fun, but the question arose, cleaning without messing up. And then also prioritizing, where does the actual toxicity arise? And one of the best biomonitors of ocean toxicity are pelagic birds. They are on the ocean their entire life. It's a pelagic bird. And this is the flesh-footed shearwater, sampled in between, as I said, Lord Howe Island and Tasmania by Jennifer Lavers. There would be no person on earth, I think, who knows more about it. And she has also an ability to extract stomach content. That's actually sample cleanup, if you wish, done by the bird, not by humans. That's sort of selected by this particular segment of the biota. I should say most of the chooks survive. They are not dead. So no animals were harmed in the course of this research, but they do die because if you look into the relative load, that would be like a human having 8 kilograms of plastic in their stomach. Anyhow, you know all these stories. We looked at these plastics, used a large infrastructure. We also took the bird feathers, plastic content and bird feathers, because bird feathers are, during the molt, essentially an excretory organ. So it is a time-stamped, durable tissue. We treated it like jewelry because it did become as expensive as jewelry. And we went through all plastics that you have seen on any of the pictures today. And right at the bottom line on the right is a nurdle, and I will focus just on the nurdle. Maybe just to go back, almost no plastic is like any other, even if it comes from the same manufacturer. There are trace elements. If they are recycled, the complexity or the complication, the compositional variation goes up, and quite unpredictably. So that is a nurdle, and you can see it's an aged nurdle. There's something already happening outside. And if we then looked into what transfers into the bird, we did find that indeed certain elements are found in the bird feathers. It's not the super strongest science because though it were probably around 50 birds, what is presently in the stomach is not necessarily what was there at the time that the feathers grew. So I have to be somewhat circumspect about what actually is in the individual bird, but if we cranked up the number, we would see the cumulative effect of bioaccumulation and then secretion in the bird feathers. And we can see here how exposure-related certain elements are found in the bird. So that's not yet toxicology, that is just the phenomenology. But as I said, it led to it turned me from a nerd at the end of the corridor into some sort of media war on television all the time. And the minister asked me, what about biodegradables? Should we make it biodegradable? And I had honestly no idea what to really answer, but it guided the next sort of progress of that meandering project, namely, what is the toxicity? Is it even desirable to have biodegradable plastics? Nurdles? Because if you do look at litter, historic litter, this is off the coast of Rhodos, been there forever. I mean, the environmental damage has been done when they made the vessels, these, chopped down the wood, but let's say the environmental cost has been incurred. We know that the plastics, sort of this from another publication, unfortunately, I didn't put the reference in, it's not our own work, shows that really the shrinkage of the nurdles has half-lives around 300 to 700 years. I mean, you almost wish you were working in the nuclear sector because there the half-lives are much more clear and also manageable. With plastics, not, because their toxicity doesn't actually reflect their half-life. We are really in a complicated situation. Now, my colleagues, same institution at Ansdorf, have actually looked at the uptake of radiation by decaying plastics. And it's absolutely beyond doubt that the decay process involves the adsorption of radionuclides. And there you can actually determine a dose, a radiation impact dose, with an incredible accuracy. And I think that's an accuracy you would never find for a single chemical, even under laboratory conditions. And there are other observations, other publications, same, equally our team, that shows how another spillage, a low dose radiation release from Fukushima, and with a low dose, totally diluted, still travels on the back of plastics to Hawaii. What does that actually mean? If you're an ecologist, you immediately recognize the compartments, the traffic rates, the rate changes. We have something, and I haven't found a better image other than this slightly psychedelic lava lamp, which I saw a couple of days ago at a friend's house, and I gazed at it. We have confined permanent concentration and releases with massive dose next to completely absent toxicity. It is incredibly difficult to monitor, and I, in bracket, doubt a little bit that more research will help us to do that. And the reason is, and it was actually a publication in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science, where we all want to publish because that's next to Nature, where scientists want to show up. The quantity, and that's almost a Friedrich Hegel type philosophy, has changed from quantity to quality. So we looked into materials that are non-decayable. And in the search for the non-decayable materials, we came across what we somewhat flippantly call a sponge, but it's not a sponge. It looks like a sponge, but it is a porous, highly robust, flexible material, a semi-porous gyroid. And the best explanation, I think, is that it has both the geometry of capillary action plus surface interactions that can be changed like a flypaper. And the flies could either be oil or nanoplastics. But what is really important, because this was not benchtop work in the lab, that was work that derived out of large-scale manufacturing. These phenomena appear at 16 tons per month production rate. We would never have found that in the lab. So we have something that works on first principle and works at scale. Now, here should be I will have to just maybe if I can get some assistance, because I will then just continue talking while someone will load the video. So if you could just load the video while I ramble on a bit. So I don't know why it didn't load. It was just, I think. Okay, just load that line. So in the next two videos, and they are real life videos, you'll see. Oh, don't even talk. But let's have a quick listen to that.
The following demonstration, water is diluted with oil. The sub-oil sponge is then placed on the surface of the water where it absorbs the oil at a rapid rate. It's the first of its kind. The oil from the sponge can be extracted and reused, and the sponge can be redeployed multiple times. When tested, the sub-oil sponge absorbed an unprecedented amount of crude oil, not just the first time it was used, but every time it was reused. At the end of its life cycle, the sponge can be refined into carbon black, hydrogen, and other products. This creates a circular economy where nothing ends up in landfill. But the sub-oil sponge is more than just a solution to a catastrophe. It can also be used to prevent a catastrophe from ever happening. Oceans today are being polluted by urban runoff.
Okay, this is runoff. I think I'll just stop it here because
Filtration system. The sponge will be adapted and fixed.
okay, go back. Okay, good. So we've just seen that. This is another. So oil is clear. If you have questions, just come back. But we want to go to the nanoplastics. It's what we downloaded here, so it's nothing edited. But you can see here, this is Captain Mark Cool, who's actually a real captain. He's out on the sea, grew up on the seas, mixing up a plastic solution, and is imitating a stormwater solution. So you see the water goes through, and the sponge, depending on the configuration, will capture a size range. Now here, the main purpose was to capture where we think the highest level of toxicity is to be expected, highest surface, which would be nanoparticles. And I think if we speed it up a bit, we will see that it can also trap, but that's simple mechanical trapping, larger plastics. But that is basically like sieving. That is not necessarily the specifics of that sponge. But we can look at the next. I think, Rob, you put another one in. Let's just see. Okay, look, I can't. You get the gist of it. It takes larger pieces, trivially like a sieve. So you would have a gradient filter in reality. And then it homes in on what is the toxicity. This is the total volume that's just filtered on a black fabric. You can then play with the gyroid geometry and the surface interactions. And then you can say, look, that broad segment of nanoparticles is out. That is probably at the point of delivery when you drink. You should possibly do it, or when it goes into drinking water. It is scalable, but we need the field experience to see where is the best point of intervention and what other existing technologies should be around that. SOAR was created in, that's Sustainable Oil Recovery and Remediation, started in 2019, 2 years after we finished the plastics survey studies, and is now an expanding international business. And it looks also into what we've just discussed, the extraction of remnant value in plastics, which is energy in an emissions limited way, I mean, low emissions. By design, the sponge already has its end of life. So energy required to decompose the sponge is significantly lower than, for example, plastics. And that is something that by extension one could apply to any plastic. Now, we did mention Sri Lanka. Here's Rob, and that was last week, I think. And just how acute the problem is. This is a well in Goa, is that correct? In Goa. And Rob deployed, in this case, just as a cursory experiment, the sponge. And the sponge does, in fact, remove any of a wide range of hydrocarbons and immediately goes into drinking. And the nose is incredibly sensitive. The water was no longer having a smell. I mean, that's just a sort of real world example. One would, in this case, probably geoengineer around the entire well. The well is lined, and then there is drinking water. So that's one use in the field. Now, this looks like a small action, but we have in the past done that. And then we had, and we've had in one of the talks before, bilateral country level engagement to look into public health issues around water. It was at the time not microplastics, but probably it could have been. And that was tackling the kidney disease problem in Sri Lanka. What it did beneficially and lastingly is these high-level interactions allowed cross-collaboration and access to funding. And I think that is been a topic here as well, that if one can elevate it enough, then I think that fuels collaboration. So SOAR is in a range of environmental applications. The last thing that I want to say is our material is hallmarked, literally like silver. It contains the elemental signature. It's not falsifiable, can be randomized. It can be every year a different one. We will never lose a single nerd. And if we lost it, we would find it. That's part of the circular economy. And I think if we want to clean up the mess, we have to have the traceability through it. Here, and that's really the last sort of slightly emergent thing, what happens in birds happens in children. And I happen to be, as sort of a remnant of having been a medical doctor at some stage, the chair of a mother's milk bank. And I can tell you what ends up at the top of the food chain. There's no company on earth that would be able to stand up against a mother with a child with neurodevelopmental delay or a cancer that is not genetic and has a pollutant that is traceable. I think that is the dragon. That's the long tail of liability, and there's no escaping it. This is an estimation of what the cost of inaction would be. It's a group in Cambridge that has published it in January. And it is clear the money is there. And if you ever asked yourself, what is the end of the oil age? This is Sheikh Yamani, who I incidentally remember because I met him as a child. He said the Stone Age didn't end because it ran out of stone. The question is, what is the oil industry or the petrochemical sector going to run out of? And I think I leave it at there. I have a couple more wild ideas, but that's enough for the moment. Thank you.
I was hoping, and I thought you were going to climb into real toxicity. You mentioned this quite a number of times. And it strikes me that that's something that we haven't really covered here. And in fact, unless we know something about the harm that this material does, it's going to be very, very hard to get governments, the public, to engage in sorting out something which we refer to as a serious problem. If it isn't demonstrated that we have a serious problem, we are, I think, not going to progress. That is something which is very hard to do, particularly if I was talking about prolonged sublethal exposure. It's very, very difficult, but it is absolutely essential. And you might say, well, I would say that as an environmental scientist, that's what I would say. But it just strikes me we have to get that fundamental understanding of where the harm is, for what sorts of plastics are causing the harm, and then we can start to address the issue of how much effort should we spend in clearing it up. If it just doesn't look very nice, it doesn't look very nice, which isn't nice. And the lady up here was referring to our sort of ethical considerations. I have to agree that that's got a value or a harm associated with not looking very nice. But it isn't going to be
You just said something that the tobacco industry has always said. Unless we know it with certainty, we can't act.
certainty isn't the word I'd use very widely, but with high confidence.
With research, the precautionary principle would say you can't do that. Because unlike radiation, you can't even model it. And when I sort of highfalutinly thought I need to quote Friedrich Hegel, it is never going to work to do more research in a model that's no longer linear. If you look, and in fact, the PNS paper was saying, are we missing a law in ecology? Namely, we are at the cliff edge, we are in complexity. There's no number of statistical tests that will actually allow it. We are always having mixed waste. We have a changing population. The rabbit runs away in zigzag, it was never came. The question is, can we nevertheless create an incentive that is not based on moral responsibility or insight? And that was actually in 1516, the Duke of Bavaria had a problem that the Bavarians were getting even more mad, drinking beer laced and polluted with all sorts of things. So he decreed that only allowed to drink beer if it has these four constituents. And I hold the monopoly for hops. That's how it paid itself. And you could easily do this for materials. It's actually already done for a range of materials. A state, in which the sort of monopoly, extractive monopoly capitalist controls in the supply chain, that you have also beautifully worked out a crucial point that earns the income. And now, in spill prediction, you know who else could earn that? And then you have the political kind of creative. I think to think that a rational, scientific, moral argument leads you anywhere after 10 years in there, I think I can only clown around on stage, but you really need teeth. But the teeth that you have do have to have some science behind it, and you need to be able to prove it in court. And we can do that. We are there. There's nothing missing. I think. Overstated perhaps, but for purpose.
I think the link between plastic pollution and particularly and health is beginning to be proven. There is quite a lot. I mean, I can show you a scary YouTube video which came out last week and was on LinkedIn, which just clearly shows the link between ingestion of plastics and nanoplastics affecting cell drug structures, causing cancer and thereby causing death. And I think that is now established. The issue is how serious the government takes it and how robust that research is.
I think there's quite a long way to go, actually. I think there's quite a long way to go before you can really say with the robust.
I'm not going to show
both human and environmental.
See what's behind it. But it is, I mean, but you know, they're talking about nanoplastics now in your semen, and therefore you're injecting, you know, babies are being born with nanoplastic pollution within them and all that sort of stuff. But it's how that, what you say, how that scientific base is.
We call it sort of that we have a plastic treaty, which I think is a good start.
Yeah.
But I think it's wrong. It should be like the nuclear non-proliferation, the chemical non-proliferation, because it's the 10,000 chemicals, 4,000 of which are probably toxic, they needed to be regulated. And that's an eminently global thing. With an economy like Germany, which is basically the driver of the chemical revolution, which if they change in the way they change their attitude to nuclear. And we have trade wars in the background, it's no problem stopping imports that do not comply with your standard.
Yeah.
I mean, say that, Brian, we don't agree, but just for the discussion.
Very hard.